Brexit. Article 50 was triggered by Theresa May yesterday when she wrote a letter to the President of the European Council, and we're in a situation now where a lot of people are very unsure about where things are going to go next. So this debate really is to look at what the prospects are for negotiations, what people can expect to get out of them, and we're joined actually initially, and I do apologise for being late, we've had some technical difficulties. Initially we're joined by David Davies, who's the Conservative MP for Monmouth, who was one of Wales's leading Brexiteer campaigners. And we also have with us Rob Griffiths, who is the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Britain. And Rob is against the EU, or has been against the EU. He stood for election quite a few times on an anti-EU ticket. And his perspective is that of a left-wing opposition to the European Union. We're hoping to be joined very shortly by Derek Vaughan, the Welsh Labour MEP for Wales, who is very much a Remainer. Derek has just joined us. Actually, we've got him online here now. So Derek,
I've sorted out all the IT problems, Martin. Yeah,
that's tremendous. That's brilliant. So we've got Derek.
I'm really pleased with myself, I can tell you.
You've done very well. You've done very well. But, right, all three of our guests are with us. We had hoped to get Kay Swinburne, who is a pro-EU Conservative, but unfortunately she is speaking at an event in Frankfurt, which is why I must make a further apology about the male preponderance of this event. Now I'll just go straight on and ask each of our three guests to explain why they held the position that they did. If they could briefly explain why they held the position they did in the referendum. So, David Davies, if you could start, perhaps.
Well, the overriding issue for me was that of sovereignty, because I believe that if you elect politicians, and those are the people who take decisions, if they take bad decisions, you should be able to kick them out. And there is a perception that the European Parliament is a sort of larger version of our own Parliament, but that's not the case, because all the power in Europe actually lies with unelected European commissioners. And I've always found over 20 years there's a certain arrogance to the whole bureaucracy in Brussels. There's clearly a desire that's been openly expressed to me to build a federal European state, and I don't think that's been properly explained to the public. And so for me, it was all about bringing powers back, just as many political parties actually wanted to bring powers down from London to Cardiff or to Scotland. I wanted to bring them from Brussels back to London. And on top of that, there's also the issue that costs, the amount of money we pay into it, getting control of immigration, some of the bureaucracy, which I just think was frustrating. But overwhelmingly, it was about sovereignty.
Okay, David, thanks very much for that. Derek Vaughan, you're obviously a proponent of the UK's membership of the EU, and were, I know, very disappointed at the vote to come out. How would you respond to what David Davies has said, and why have you been such a strong supporter of the UK remaining in the EU?
Well, David, who I know very well, didn't actually mention anything to do about the economy then, and that was the main reason why I was a strong supporter of us staying in the European Union. From a Welsh point of view, and I represent all of Wales, Wales is a huge net beneficiary of EU funds. We are net beneficiaries to the tune of over £200 million a year. Indeed, if you look across Wales, there's hardly an infrastructure project, a town centre development, training scheme, apprenticeship scheme, job creation scheme, which isn't partly funded by the EU. And for us to lose that money post 2019 is going to be a disaster for our economy. In addition to that, of course, Wales still has a large manufacturing base, and most of our manufactured goods are exported to the European Union. And when we come out of the single market and the customs union, as the UK government wants to, I do fear for our manufacturing base. You know, what's going to happen to these companies who currently invest in Wales? Are they going to stay here if they've got to pay tariffs on their exports? I worry for our farming industry as well. You know, so for me, it was all about the economy. And Wales will be damaged hugely when we leave the European Union, and it'll be even worse if we leave the single market.
Thanks very much, Derek. Now, Rob Griffiths, you're General Secretary of the Communist Party of Britain. You're also, I know, a very strong trade unionist. Why did you think, given particularly what Derek Vaughan has just said, that it's such a good idea to come out of the EU?
Well, I stand very much in the tradition of Tony Benn and the late leader of the railway workers, Bob Crow. I think from the very beginning, the European Union, and before that, the European Common Market, has been a big business racket. It's an exercise in free market fundamentalism. It's fundamentally anti-democratic, and it was actually born out of a Cold War project to create an anti-socialist United States of Europe. And we're now seeing the reintroduction of those early attempts to have a military dimension to the EU, as well as an economic dimension. Manufacturing in Wales and Britain has taken an enormous hammering since we joined the European Union, or the Common Market, in 1973, and the free movement of capital, the free movement of goods between them have served to enormously undermine our manufacturing base in Wales and Britain. And if we just take one example, the crisis in the steel industry, we are powerless to protect ourselves against enormous European imports, 7 times bigger than the Chinese imports that some people go on about. We can't take emergency measures to limit those imports or to place any kind of tariffs on them because we have no control over our trading policies, just as there are whole other areas of economic policy and increasingly social policy over which we would have no control as members of the European Union.
Can I respond to the point on the steel industry, which is obviously very important? I was leader of Neath Port Talbot Council for a long time, and I know the Tata Steelworks there very well. The European Union wanted to take action. It wanted to limit exports from China. It wanted to increase the amount of tariffs put on Chinese.
But China's irrelevant, Derek. We import 7 times more from the rest of Europe than we do from China. But it's not just Chinese imports, you know.
Yeah, but the UK government was the ones who was stopping any action. And if the UK government wanted to help, there's flexibility within the state aid rules to allow them to do that. Italy, for example, renationalised the steel industry. Every year, Germany gives a huge subsidy to its steel industry. So we're able to do that. But it was a conscious decision by the UK government not to provide the help and the support.
Only on the question of Chinese. We can't do anything about those imports from the rest of Europe, Derek, and they are far, far greater than the relatively small imports from China.
Rob, I think it's possible to see some intellectual merit in your argument. However, it seems to me that it may have a significant flaw, which is that you're coming from a socialist perspective, and obviously you're wanting to have a socialist Britain. But the reality of the political situation at the moment is that we have what many people on the left would see as quite a hard right conservative government under Theresa May, which has got every chance. I mean, they're leading the opinion polls by nearly 20%. They're going to be in power for a long time. Are you not concerned that the kind of social protections that you would like to see in a British state are just going to be completely eroded by...
Well, as a socialist, of course, I'm also an optimist, and therefore I don't accept for a moment that we already know the result of a general election that's not going to happen for another 3 years. I also remember, Martin, and you were around then, in the 1980s, we were told that it was politically impossible for us ever to see another majority Labour government. In fact, it was mathematically impossible that we would ever again see another majority Labour government. So I don't accept that it's absolutely impossible for us to see a left-led Labour government after the next general election, and that government must be free to take the economic and social measures that would be in the interests of the vast majority of people.
Okay, David, if I could bring you in slightly on this point here. We've got this great repeal bill coming forward, and clearly what is happening is that the elements of European law that the British Parliament has had to obey, as it were, are going initially to be incorporated into English and Welsh law, certainly, and in some cases across the whole of the UK. But the difficulty is that perhaps a Conservative government might feel inclined to repeal some of the social protections that we have. For example, employment rights that exist, for example, environmental protection measures that have been taken and which we currently have to follow as members of the European Union. Do you have any concerns yourself about what may happen in that context?
Let me just say there's no way that's going to happen, and I'll come back to it in a second. I just want to pick up on two quick points though by the other speakers. Firstly, I think Rob was talking about the possibility of a Conservative or Labour government or Socialist government, and for what, I find myself strangely agreeing with a member of the Communist Party. It's utterly impossible to predict what's going to happen at any election. And you are quite right, sir. Labour were written off in the 1980s. Actually, the Conservatives were being written off at the early 2000s. I think Labour were written off in the early 1960s as well. The press love this story of let's write off the Labour or the Tory party or the Liberal Democrats. They usually bounce back one way or another. So I'll go along with that point completely. Now, Derek made the point that Wales was wrong to vote out because we are net recipients of EU money. That's the first point he made. Well, that is technically true, but of course Britain is a net contributor to the European Union. So by Derek's own logic, it was absolutely right for a majority of people in Britain overall to vote to leave the European Union on cash grounds. And the fact of the matter is we put about 19 billion in. We get about 9 or 10 billion back, depending on which a lot of figures you want to believe. So there's about £9 billion extra there, which means we can continue to spend money in Wales on infrastructure, on agriculture and the other things, science, for example, and research for universities. We can do all of that, and we're going to have an extra £9 billion on top. Now, to answer your question in a bit more detail about the legislation, this is part of the kind of the fears that are being whipped up. There's no way that a Conservative government, you may say it's right-wing, I don't feel it's particularly right-wing, and actually it's trying to reach out much to the centre ground. There's no way we're going to tear up environmental legislation, health and safety legislation, workers' rights or anything like that. We don't want to do that. I'm on the right of the party. I don't want to do that. And there's certainly nobody to the left of me that wants to do it. It's just not going to happen. Well, why would we do that? It wouldn't make us very popular. We don't want to do it. We don't need to do it. We're not going to do it.
Derek, do you have concerns along those lines?
Oh, absolutely. The UK government had the opportunity to give these guarantees on workers' rights when Article 50 was being triggered, and they made sure it was voted down. And we've heard the words of David Davies and Liam Fox, who've all said, that they want to scrap EU red tape, and EU red tape is workers' rights, is environmental protection, is consumer rights. That's what they want to do. We've heard talk of a new economic model when we leave the European Union, and the new economic model is tax haven, and we have low regulations, particularly on workers' rights. There are some on the far right of the Conservative Party, have been wanting the chance to impose this new economic model for a long time, and unfortunately, when we leave the European Union, they'll have the chance, bit by bit by bit, they will scrap many of the workers' rights protections we have from the UK at the moment.
No, I don't believe that for one second. I mean, I am on the right of the Conservative Party. I don't want to do that, and I don't know anyone else who does. I haven't heard it being suggested. We may look at a low tax economy if that would encourage inward investment. That's certainly true. But the idea of scrapping health and safety regulations, workers' rights, privatising the NHS, I mean, that one's been cropping up ever since about 1987. It's just not true. And while we're at it, just moving on slightly, I keep hearing people from other EU countries saying, well, we're really worried we're going to get chucked out in a few years' time. This includes my wife, by the way. I mean, she's a Hungarian national. We're not going to do that either. And we never wanted to, never said we would. These are just scare stories. They're not going to happen. We're not stupid. But we don't want to do it. We wouldn't get re-elected if we did. We'd have.
But the words coming from your ministers.
No, they're not.
Liam Fox have talked about scrapping EU red tape, about deregulation.
Can I disagree with David and agree with Derek? I think we have always to be vigilant about employment and trade union rights, for example, when we've got a Conservative government. We've had one barrage of anti-trade union legislation already on the eve of the referendum. It was watered down a little in the hope of winning some more votes for the Remain side, actually. But of course, we can't trust Conservative governments. We've had 12 anti-trade union laws since 1979 from Conservative governments, and we always have to watch out for what they'll try to do in terms of whittling down workers' rights and trade union rights. And should they attempt to do that, of course we'll need unity in the labour movement and in the trade unions. Whatever our views on the European Union, we'll need unity in order to resist it. But I can't go along either with the defeatism of the TUC and some others who somehow imagine that we are completely defenceless against anti-trade union measures if we're outside the EU. The EU has never lifted a finger against any one of those 12 anti-trade union laws we've had since 1979. We've had to rely on our own strength. And if that's what we have to do, we'll have to make sure we do it next time around, should the Conservatives once again try to whittle away our rights.
David, one of the big arguments from a Welsh perspective relates to the nature of Brexit. And of course, the Welsh Government published this white paper to Plaid Cymru, in which they were arguing for a soft Brexit, as opposed to the hard Brexit that Theresa May seems intent on pursuing. What is your perspective on this concept of unfettered access to the single market? Do you think that there is merit in what the Welsh Government has been arguing, or are you in favour of just a clean break with Europe and then perhaps reversion to WTO rules?
Ideally, I'm in favour of keeping this transition as smooth as possible, and that would imply staying in the single market. But it's not going to be possible to do that, according to the European Union, unless we're willing to accept their immigration rules, and that's not going to be acceptable. So let's talk more about access to the single market. In other words, being able to trade freely, they with us and us with them. That would be an ideal thing. I don't think we want to be part of the customs union. I mean, one of the whole purposes of this is that we can set our own trade deals with other countries. But inside or access to the single market, yes. But what's going to make that most likely is allowing the government to go off and negotiate to look for that, but to make it very clear to the European Union that if they're not willing to play the game, then we will carry on and leave the European Union and trade on WTO rules. If we give the impression that, look, guys, we want to sit down here, we want access to the single market, and if we fail to get it, then of course we'll stay in the European Union. Well, we're not going to get it, are we? So all these people, and I'm sorry, but many in the Labour Party are saying, right, we should only go ahead with this if we can have full access to the single market. If we don't get it, we'll just have to stay in the EU. These people are actually making the negotiation position utterly impossible. You can't go into a negotiation if you're not willing to walk away if you don't get what you want.
So, Derek, if we did have to revert to WTO rules, what would the consequences of that be for Wales and the UK?
Well, we would have to pay tariffs on our exports. You know, it's the World Trade Organization, not the World Free Trade Organization. There would be tariffs, for example, on cars exported from Wales and the UK of around 10%, on agricultural produce, on meat in particular, up to 40%. You know, that's going to put a huge burden on the manufacturing industry and on our farmers. So farmers could go bust, and I do worry about the large manufacturers we have in Wales. Are they going to stay in Wales if they're going to face those tariffs? And it's not just tariffs on their exports. You know, most of the cars are assembled from parts which they import from the rest of the European Union. So there's tariffs on the parts coming in, and there'll be a tariff on the final product going out. So it would have a devastating effect on our economy, and it's not rational. It doesn't make sense, and I'm really surprised and shocked that a UK government could put our economy under threat by saying it wants to leave the single market.
Rob, do you have any concerns about tariffs?
Well, I'm not a free market fundamentalist, and therefore I think we should elect governments that have the power to regulate the movement of goods, the movement of capital, the movement of labour, and to put an end to the super exploitation of migrant labour, for example, which being in the EU makes all too easy. Yes, of course, low tariff trade is usually preferable. Don't forget the European Union places very high tariffs on imports from outside Europe. If those were removed because we are no longer in the single market, that would make a lot of imported goods, including inputs to industry, a lot cheaper. But because we have a trade deficit with the EU, if both sides were to put tariffs on trade between Britain and the EU, the fact is we would actually gain a lot more than our exporters would have to pay in tariffs. And the tariffs that we place on EU goods could then be used to offset the cost to exporters of any extra tariffs to the EU. So, I don't understand why trade unionists and people in the Labour Party are suddenly committed to the principles of free market fundamentalism, including free trade.
Turning to another issue, which perhaps is going to come more to the fore, there are serious concerns amongst universities which rely and have relied increasingly over the last few years on tuition fees paid for by foreign students, that there is going to be a significant drop in those foreign students coming here because they think that, let's put it bluntly, there's an increase in racism in the UK. Now, we've just heard very recently, in the last couple of days, the University of South Wales is having to make significant job cuts because of a reduction in the number of students who have indicated that they want to come and study there. And this, I know, has been replicated in other Welsh universities. Derek, do you see this as a particular problem?
Yeah, it's going to be a big problem. And as you said, Martin, it's already started. And we talk about the free movement of people, and we forget sometimes that it's been a good thing. It does allow students from the EU to come to the UK. It allows many of our students here in the UK and Wales to go and study and train abroad. That's one of the advantages of having freedom of movement. And unfortunately, lots of us who have been pro-EU in the past perhaps haven't said loud enough what the benefits of free movement are. We know, for example, that EU citizens living and working in the UK put into the UK economy £2.5 billion a year more than they take out, because they're mainly young people who come here to work or to study. So free movement in general is a good thing, and we should have said that much louder in the past.
David, would you accept that there has been a rise in racism as a consequence of the Brexit vote, and that is acting as some disincentive to people coming to study and work in the UK who could contribute to our economy?
Well, the first answer is no, I wouldn't. There has been a reported rise in hate crime that has been going on for a very long time now, and it preceded the Brexit referendum. And it's partly because of the way that hate crimes can now be reported. They can be reported by anyone. Anything that is perceived by anyone as a hate crime can be reported as such. And the police are expected to increase the amount of hate crime that's being reported. So we're getting big increases, that's for sure. The reality is, I think, when you talk to people from Eastern Europe, and don't forget I'm married to one, is that actually this idea that people are walking around being abused the whole time just isn't true. It just is not true at all. And I worry that in some ways this fear is being whipped up and used as a kind of stick to beat people with. The people who voted for Brexit are not racist. And it's almost as though we're being tarnished with this idea of racism as become an easy way to insult people who voted to leave. I totally reject any form of racism. I do believe in freedom, in controlling freedom of movement and controlling immigration, and I do worry a little bit about the lack of integration by some communities in the UK, but that really doesn't have very much to do with Brexit itself. I also
acknowledge, David, that there has been a problem which is affecting more and more universities in terms of students coming here because of their perception that the UK is becoming a more racist country.
Well, then I think we all have a duty to say that behind the statistics, the reality is that the vast majority of people can walk around the streets of this country without experiencing racism from anyone. And just as yesterday I stood on Westminster Bridge with Muslims to demonstrate the unity that exists amongst different religions in this country, and with a rabbi as well, and Christians, all there on the bridge there with police officers to commemorate the people who lost their lives last week. I think it'd be quite nice occasionally if if perhaps the people recognise that the 99% of those who've supported Brexit and who worry about immigration and integration are not in any way racist and shouldn't be tarnished that way.
Rob, do you think that would you acknowledge that there has been a problem in this context?
Well, funnily enough, I've almost become a regular on London broadcasting on this issue on behalf of Lexit, the Left Leave campaign. And I've pointed out, yes, there was a spike in reports of hate crime in the period immediately after the referendum result. And one hate crime is too many, and any increase is to be deplored and to be combated. Having said that, the figures have now actually returned to the same trend as they were before the referendum result. And you know, obviously these the morons responsible for this, some of them feel emboldened by the June the 23rd result and so on, but they represent a tiny minority of the population, and they represent a tiny minority of those who voted Brexit. By the way, you know, anti-migrants, anti-benefits for migrant workers, anti-immigration arguments were used by both sides in the referendum campaign, and it was a pretty unedifying spectacle, quite honestly. In fact, the whole campaign was largely reactionary on both sides. But look, Britain's got, and Wales, we've got quite a good record in people living together and mixing together and so on. I don't think that the large supply of students that we have from overseas, why we just think the rest of the world consists of Europe, by the way, I don't know. We have huge numbers of Chinese students here. We have students from the Middle East, from Africa and so on. They've been very welcome in the past. There's no reason to believe that they're going to be anything but very welcome in the future.
Okay, turning to
sorry, Martin. Let me just say we can't get away. We can't get away from the fact.
Turning to the negotiations that are shortly going to start as a consequence of Article 50, I think that there could be a very serious stumbling block quite early, and in fact, this could arise as a result of discussion about the so-called divorce bill. That the EU is likely to present to the UK government during a very early part of the negotiations. Derek, do you think that there is a serious possibility that the negotiations could come to a very abrupt end as a consequence of a row over this divorce bill?
Let me first of all say something on the actual bill. The first estimate done by the Commission was 60 billion euros, but that's just the UK liabilities. We need to take off that any which the UK has a share of. So I think the final bill is going to be more likely to be around 30 billion euros. And it's money which the UK has committed to the EU budget, is to pay for things like European structural funds and agricultural funding and research and development. The UK has committed money to the EU budget to pay for those things up until 2023. So we're gonna have to pay something. And of course the EU is saying, unless the UK commits to paying this divorce bill, its liabilities, then discussions will not move on to other things which the UK wants to discuss, like a future trade agreement, for example. I'm open at the start of negotiations that maybe that they can decide what the methodology is of arriving at a figure which will allow them to move on. But there is a possibility if the EU does slap the bill on the table and the UK says absolutely no, we're not paying that, and walks away, that could cause problems at the very start of negotiations. I'm hoping that they can find a way around it to allow them to move on to other discussions.
David, what's your perspective on this? Do you think we should pay this bill or not?
Well, we're paying 20 billion a year at the moment into the EU. So, I mean, Derek's talking about another 18 months worth. We're going to be paying that anyway. We're not going to be out for 2 years. So we're going to be paying another 40 billion in. I mean, these are huge figures. If you say, well, you've got to pay a divorce bill of 30 billion, that sounds like a lot of money. But when you say, well, that's 18 months membership of the EU, I mean, quite honestly, I expect we're going to have to pay something. I don't know what it'll be, but we're not going to get away with it scot-free. If we want to have some sort of access to the single market, we'll probably have to pay something. And whether or not it's worth it, that's something that's got to be thought through. I'm not wholly opposed to the idea. I think we've got to be ready to walk away, completely trade under WTO rules, and say you're not having a penny. But if they're offering something, well, we can offer something. That's how negotiations work. And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't rule it out.
What do you reckon, Rob?
Well, I mean, I wish we had, you know, John McDonnell, Jeremy Corbyn negotiating on our behalf instead of a Conservative government. Having said that, of course, we should pay our debts, but the one good thing about the position that we're in Britain at the moment, even with Theresa May and the rest of them there, and that is, if we don't like what they negotiate, we have the chance at the future election to pass our verdict on them and to remove them. We have the chance, we have the opportunity possibly to do that even before the negotiations were concluded. I was in Ireland recently, and I've been in France and Portugal and so on over recent months. I've been able to say to people, if we don't like our negotiators, we'll have a chance to register our protest. Most people in Europe don't have the faintest idea who's going to be representing them in the negotiations. It's Michel Barnier, by the way, and certainly they'll never get an opportunity to express their view at the ballot box about what they think of his conduct.
Derek.
That's how fundamentally anti-democratic the European Union is.
Thanks, Rob. Derek, it is the case that Wales, in cash terms, has benefited a lot from membership of the EU in terms of structural funds, in terms of the common agricultural policy for farmers. Do you think it is realistic to believe that after Brexit, the UK government will make up the money that Wales would otherwise have received?
For structural funds, no. There's no way a UK government of any colour is going to give Wales the equivalent of £2.4 billion over the programming period. I think there's slightly more hope for agriculture. I think the UK government will want to put in place an agricultural policy. I don't think farmers are going to get the same level of subsidies as they can in the European Union. But I'm sure the UK government will want to keep farmers by giving them something.
David, do you think, as Carwyn Jones has demanded, that every penny that is lost from the European Union budget for Wales should be made up by the UK government?
Yes, I do. I think it should be, and I think it will be. I think ministers have already said that. The money's going to be there anyway. We're talking already about the mechanism for doing that. Carwyn has said that we should make sure that it's not done through the Barnett formula, and I agree. I think we're coming to a consensus, actually, despite all the rhetoric, that the money needs to be hypothecated towards the areas that are already getting it. And I think we can be talking fairly certainly about this right through the next funding period, 2021 to 2026, I think. And then after that, I mean, there'll be some uncertainty. But quite obviously, the answer to this question is yes. And as chairman of the Welsh Affairs Select Committee, I'd be expecting the government to deliver on that.
Are you reassured by David's comments, Rob?
Well, look, the net contribution that Wales gets from the EU, which, as David has pointed out, is only recycled British money anyway, but the net contribution that Wales gets is about 1% or less of the block grant from the Westminster government. So the idea that if we don't have the EU handing us back some of the money we contributed in the first place, all of these programmes in Wales are going to somehow collapse. As I say, you could increase the block grant from Westminster by 1 or 2%, and that already covers it. The fact is, of course, we've also been contributing billions that have gone straight down the drain, that is the common agricultural policy. We used to have a much better and more progressive system of agricultural support here in Britain, thanks to the post-war Labour government and Tom Williams, the Welsh MP for Warrington. We had to give that up to join the ridiculously wasteful, high-tax, high-price common agricultural policy. Getting out of the EU might give us an opportunity, should give us an opportunity to get out of those kind of policies altogether and to adopt the kind of progressive, supportive, low-price agricultural policy that we used to have before we entered the common market.
Okay, well, I think we've run out of time. Look, thanks very much indeed to all three of you for your very considerable contributions, all of which were interesting. I'm very grateful to you. And thanks to everyone who has watched now and who watches on the catch-up tape later. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Martin.